Welcome to our Going Green podcast. Today we're going to have a look at the topic of environmental activism. And there's a few things that are going on at the moment. So the first one is called the Big Power Off. And on April the 10th in the UK, there was a planned 10-minute blackout at 10 p.m. And the idea was that everyone switches off everything at 10 p.m. Sounds a good idea. And after 10 minutes, to put it all back on again and see if we can damage the grid and upset everyone.
The actual, like I say, the point of this wasn't actually necessarily to cut the power off. It is effectively a 10-minute boycott of having power, if that makes any sense. As in, you didn't have any power because you turned off at your breaker. Therefore, you weren't using any power at all. So therefore, technically, your provider shouldn't charge you for that time because obviously you haven't actually physically used any power whatsoever. Anyway, these people, they estimate, and it's probably about right, that 10 minutes of power supplies the energy companies or the electricity suppliers with a probably estimated £9 million. That's sort of about right, and that's the revenue, £9 million in revenue, and that seems fairly reasonable in regards to how. And so, by everybody turning off and shutting off their breaker and using no power, effectively, the energy supplier would have dumped £9 million worth of power into the grid, but the grid couldn't do anything with. And then suddenly, they demanded back that power.
Well, when you switch things on, everything sort of generally requires a little bit more power, just to sort of get everything on. So you put your TV back on just to standby. The fridge comes back on, and it's been a bit cool, warmer because it's been off. So therefore, it's going to use that little bit more electricity. So everything is going to use that little bit more electricity for a few moments, or even perhaps a few minutes, just to get started again. And that also caused some problems to the grid, didn't it?
Yeah. So the answer is, this is the interesting thing, is they claim, or not necessarily they claim, but it's one of those things where the UK's electrical grid has built-in capacity and surge protection, because of course, when a football game happens at half time, everybody wants a cup of tea, and so the grid needs to be able to have a surge or power this sudden surge of kettles going, for all the people, and that's the national grid has this capacity, has this surge. I say protection in it, but it's not quite but anyway, but essentially that.
So these are the hydroelectric power stations. We visited them on holidays in Wales, and they can, within a few moments, I don't know, it's about a few seconds, isn't it? They can actually release the water out of the top reservoir through these turbines, and they can ramp up the amount of power output terrifically on the grid. They just can't sustain it for an awful long time. And of course, these things, although they are generating a lot of electricity, they're only using a head of water to do that. And once they've used up that head of water, then typically they either have to wait for a few months while it rains, or more sensibly, what they do is they take the water from the lower reservoir and they pump it back up to the top reservoir when electricity is cheap and plentiful, like overnight, when people aren't using it.
No, exactly. So, it's this idea that this sort of thing is meant to basically help the energy crisis. It's meant to help make a problem and cause, they did this once. They did this on the 10th of April, and so nothing happened. The electricity supply was a flat at 50 hertz, by the way. They didn't actually affect anything, but they said the reservoir, these people are now claiming that the reservoirs are now empty because, of course, it's going to take a while and a lot of and a lot of electricity and time to pump up the reservoirs back up. So to help this problem, or to solve the next surge, which is where they're planning now to do it. I say this coming Saturday, and they're planning to do it once again because now the reservoirs are empty. There is no surge protection, so now is the time to strike essentially, and effectively do this.
So that's then they're going to do on the 16th of April here in the UK. They want to do this time 7 p.m., which is going to be perhaps a more important time they can consider to sort of try a blackout. I suppose they want to try 7 p.m. because it's actually going to be light at 7 p.m. So you're not expecting people, as they expected last time, to sit in the dark for 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm glad it's one of those things where welcome to activism. Now, the point about doing all this is actually, I think I want to say a bit more historical. That's the wrong way to describe it. But actually, in Spain, in 2019, Spain did this, or the Spanish people did this. Yeah, they basically did this. This is what this campaign is copying off. And effectively what happened is the people of Spain managed to cause lots of brownouts. This is where the surge was too great and they couldn't supply, Spain's power grid couldn't supply all its customers. Now, inside that protection, what happened was the Spanish power production, the government says to the Spanish power producers, right, your contract is to supply your providers with power. That's fair enough. That makes more sense. But what happened is when a brownout happened and it's not caused by a weather event or a storm, it's then you've unable to supply the power to your customers, aka breaching the contract. Therefore, you've got to pay to your customers the money they had already spent on buying the power that you didn't provide. So basically, they got a refund. Now, at the same time of all this, Spain's government managed to do emergency powers and forced all these companies to actually spend money on their power electricity supply system, because of course their national grid essentially isn't as robust as the UK is. They have a much smaller capacity and a very much smaller surge protection, which of course that's what the government their Spanish government did. They got these companies to actually spend money on making sure they have enough surge protection because they don't want the brownouts. Yeah, so it's one of those things where for the next couple of years, Spain's power supply, the electricity supply, was actually lower than what it was. Yes, it's gone up now, but that's a different, that things have changed. But at the time, it was going up. They did this essentially boycott, the big power off, and they managed to make and drive prices back down because, of course, basically they cheated in the fact of managed a way to break the electrical company's contracts. Yeah, this is where they pay money used to supply power, but they didn't supply power. Admittedly, it's one of those things. It's pedantic, except of course it worked. So this is the idea of what this whole campaign protest is about recreating the Spanish conditions in the making sure, creating a brownout for people. And so the electricity suppliers suddenly people are paying for the electricity, but there isn't anything. And then they've broken the contract. So therefore the gas company or the electricity suppliers should pay back and effectively lower electricity supply for a little bit to the customers, therefore relieving what everybody's calling is the cost of living crisis.
So we've got this cost of living crisis. We know the cost of fuel, gas, coal is gone up because of various different problems around the world, including the Ukrainian crisis. However, this country, the UK, has got one of the best national grids around. And we do have a large number of reservoirs that come on and do supply the power. And when they tried this system, basically it failed. It didn't bring the brownouts. It didn't bring everything down to its knees. Now, I suppose if you wanted to try and do that, you'd have to be a little bit more, I don't know what, let's think it more active in trying to do it. Let's say have a power off every 10 minutes, every hour. That would sort of really upset the system.
Yes.
Because then the surge system, the extra power couldn't be properly provided. And that means then the energy companies wouldn't provide electricity. We would have some areas that don't get electricity or just don't get enough, which would be a brownout. And then you can complain to say you're not providing electricity because you haven't got a big enough, better enough system, and therefore you need to invest more money in electricity. Unfortunately, that could also have the opposite problem that they say, yeah, okay, we've got to pay more, get more investment, therefore we'll put the prices up and you can pay, you, the customer, can actually pay while we build more.
So, yeah, unfortunately, that's what's likely to have there. Instead of sort of digging into their profits, all they're going to do is say, right, we need to invest in all this surge protection, which is technically what you want, but you don't want. And say, unfortunately, you've got to pay for it, and people are going to so they raise bills, which is not.
It's exactly the opposite to what this campaign is trying to do. They're trying to make awareness of the cost of living crisis, and they're saying that electricity bills, gas bills are going up a lot, and they certainly are. And if we do this, it'll bring it down. No.
Well, the answer is we don't quite know because we didn't have the brownout. Therefore, the companies weren't voided or breaching their contracts. The problem is, you see, is that you've got to make them breach the contracts. But are these companies who are making record profits going to bite into that profit? And we've seen them time and time again. The answer is they don't. All they do is simply move the bottom line upwards so that the top line could go up so they can make more profit. So, the answer is, at the same time, this is a good way of doing or protesting in regards to. The answer is it requires a significant proportion of people, and even better or even worse, it also requires a significant portion of other places. We're talking sort of, what if all the commercial buildings in the UK did that? So at 7 p.m. when they're not working, they all did that. Suddenly, that would actually cause more because of the amount of power they use. Yeah.
If you look at something like, and I use a website called gridwatch.co.uk, and that shows every day what sort of at every sort of moment in time, how much electricity we're using, what the demand is, and how they're filling it. And our bottom level is with nuclear, because that can't be switched on and off during the daytime when more electricity is being used. Fortunately for us, we have some solar, and on some days we get a lot of solar, and other days
not so much. But then initially we also got then the wind power mix, and although which on the windy days blows more power, and then and you can see the mixes of different power, and occasionally over the winter when it wasn't as windy as expected, we actually had to put on
more gas.
More gas, because they made the executive decision not to do coal. That was over the COP26. They decided just burn more gas, which unfortunately is a problem because that's the power mix, which is why the government in its plan is trying to do this new like strategy. This what's it called? It's the energy security strategy. It's not something that rolls off the tongue quite straight.
Yeah, we do need more electricity. Every year, we are using more and more and more electricity, and that means more and more at the moment fossil fuel until we can get enough nuclear. And there are a lot of people that argue, is nuclear a good solution? Well, it doesn't make any fossil fuel, sort of, it doesn't do any sort of carbon dioxide. It does have some nuclear waste,
Yeah.
but it's not that much nuclear waste. Nuclear uh, is really efficient in sort of what it does
Yes.
in generating energy. You get much more. I would like to call it bang for your buck, I suppose, but it's way more efficient. You get way more energy out of nuclear, so it's quite useful. And if we can get some fusion reactions going, it might be even better than that because they're not even going to have any sort of rubbish waste. However, they do take a long time to get going, these machines.
Yes.
And if you want to buy new ones, they've got a 30 we reckon there's about a 30-year shelf life for a nuclear reactor.
30 to 40. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that sort of time. And 10 years ago, we should have started replacing these reactors, but various governments, and I'm not just going to blame this one, but I think it's just about all of them, weren't on the ball. They didn't want to do various things with this, that, and the other. And so they didn't buy and build some nuclear power stations to replace the aging ones. So now we're in a pickle.
Yes. But this is where, we're looking at the wholesale price of gas and things. It's where we're now going to do a review of whether or not we should allow fracking to take place in this country. Now, I'm not putting any arguments. I'm just saying they're going to look about whether they should allow it or not again, because of course they know that there needs to be a transition from the fossil fuels to the green fuels, and unfortunately, that middle needs to come from somewhere, and you need to develop all the green stuff, but you've got to need it. You need it now. So sort of, which is one of those things where problems of, the people are claiming that the government more is that they're sort of sidelining green policies over because they're trying to sort everything out now. They're trying to make sure that we have the power now, and sort of, and the environment groups aren't wrong in regards to these people are doing this, but it's one of those things where you've got to look at sort of they're trying to provide power for everybody at now, rather than sort of say, well, we'll get there. We're building the power plant. You can have your power when that's built. It'd be an
But
incentive.
people want it now.
But people want it now. You see, you can't just suddenly say, right, no more power until we go green. And people, but, yeah, exactly. So so there's a whole problems of like it's like the government wants to has in handing out lots of these North Sea oil
Contracts, yes.
things.
But
Uh,
but I look at this, and we've got a problem at the moment. We've got a short-term problem with Ukraine and Russia and the oil not being, and gas probably, and people want to say, yes, let's try and stop all of that. And that's a lovely idea, except of course, if you stop that, and you're Germany and 40% of your gas comes from Germany, from Russia, if they stop that 40%, then that means 40% of houses industry in Germany doesn't get any electricity. And that's a big problem.
yes, and it doesn't. They unfortunately they're sort of saying these places don't get electricity, they can't run. Think luckily we're going to summer, so less likely problems of winter, sort of as in needing to heat homes. But it's all these things. Is this the problem of, let's say they say no to all these things and get cut off, for weather reason, then suddenly they will have brownouts, they will have problems, and then suddenly that will be a crisis for everybody, not just the people, but the government, everybody having this huge calamity, and so they need a way to prevent it. Easy way to prevent it, unfortunately, is to use gas and coal from all the other. I say gas and coal. Use gas
And,
and
and
oil.
that's the short term. Yeah, obviously, in the long term, I know our government's looking at increasing our wind power. And if they can build wind power around the country, it's going to be windy somewhere because we live on a fairly windy island. So we could sort our own electricity out quite easily. Other countries can't do it perhaps as well. So we can invest in renewables. It's going to take time, and it is going to take effort to try and do that. We are looking at the rise of electric cars. They are becoming more popular, and we'll do a podcast on that shortly. But can I afford one? And this is the other problem with the cost of electricity. I'm talking to my mum. She's an old age pensioner. And she says, well, gas prices are going up. Therefore, do I actually turn my gas off and don't put my central heating on, and I just sit there with a blanket? And I'm dreading this. And I think the only way I can do to this help to my mother is say, well, don't worry about this. You pay for your gas bill. It's going to go up by an awful lot. They've said to hers it's going to go up by £4,000. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, and we'll find out in the future. And it's whether I can afford to actually have to pay that to keep her warm in her house.
It is this dynamic sort of problem of, where do you get your fuel? How do you power the daily economy? But it's also looking at, say, people need to make sure we're going green. This is where all these groups, climate groups, they're happy to yell and scream from the rooftops that we must stop these things. But you ask a simple question of sort of how do these protests move around? Are they living these nicely? Because we found quite early in the Extinction Rebellion protests that were happening, 3 years ago now?
Yeah.
Something like that. That all these people trumpeting climate change, or not trumpeting climate change, government stop climate change. I'll get my message right. And it found that lots of them sort of didn't have any solutions, or more precisely, what actually was found, that they were doing the talk, but they weren't walking the walk. And so it was actually found that loads of them were, I say, not being, they were happy to protest and say the government should be doing more, but they weren't doing more themselves. And it's sort of, do you are you just protesting because you are mad about something, or do you really believe and want change, if that makes any sense? It's one of those odd circumstances in relation to that.
So let's ask a simple question. Do you think this big switch off worked? I suppose this is the first question. And I think the answer to that is no. And it didn't work because they wanted the power to sort of go off and almost not come back on again. Companies in big problems. Therefore, they had to spend a lot of money. They'd also have to invest a lot. They'd reduce prices. But that's a very blinkered view of how things are going to work. And, well, it didn't happen because simply they coped. So if there were no brownouts, there were no sort of major cut-offs, then people just said, well, we went without electricity for 10 minutes. We won't pay our electricity, because we don't need to pay that because we didn't use any, except it probably won't make much difference because to power everything back on, then they used more electricity. So it probably didn't actually save them anything. If the people decided to sort of switch off several pieces of equipment, then that can make a difference. Perhaps what might make more difference is if people decided to unplug their televisions at night. That might make a big difference.
Change from standby, isn't it?
Yes. So try and get things switched off. If you're not using your computer, how about switching it off at night? A lot of people leave them on. Can you sort of make sure that when you leave a room, you switch off the lights? Can you do your own little switch off? And I think if everybody did that, A, it's going to make a less demand on the electricity grid, but also it's actually going to cut your fuel bills down. And basically that's what people want. People want, I suppose, really their cake and eat it. They want to have loads of more power. They want to have this, that, and the other, but they don't want to pay for it.
Yes. Yeah. And I can understand not wanting to pay for it directly.
You don't pay for it.
Shush.
Yeah, I pay for it. Yes.
But it was more importantly the fact that sort of, the such as they want all this infrastructure, they want all the luxuries of these things, but unfortunately, to have the luxury, you've got to have the necessities, and it's one of those things where is power a necessity? And I don't. It's one of those things where I don't think it is one of these lovely human rights things. Access to electricity.
Well, you see, I'm quite old, and I grew up in an age where we didn't have an electric everything. I didn't have a mobile phone until I was sort of an adult. And I can put my mobile phone down and I can not pick it up for several days, and I'm happy with that. I do that to a student of mine and say, put your phone down for an hour while you have a lesson, while you're doing this. And they struggle, they can't. I remember a few years ago we had a pool, and my next door neighbour, the little girl, she wanted to come in and bring her friend, and I said that was fine. And her friend had her mobile phone, and she had to keep getting out of the pool every few minutes to check her mobile phone just to make sure that nobody had sort of texted her and said something, and she couldn't live without her phone. And she had to be online. And to do that, that meant she needed power. And if we look at how much electricity you use to power the internet, it's an awful lot.
Well, yes, it is one of those things where, you look back at sort of, what's the nut? Do we need this power? And the answer is we're now so connected to everything. The answer is we actually do need this power.
Yeah.
Which is and that's how society changed. It's not the fact that we aren't using power because we don't need it. We're using power because we want it. We are using it to do all the stuff. And that unfortunately isn't free. It isn't sort of this magic stuff. It's, comes out of nowhere. There has to be, like I say, at the end of it, someone's going to foot the bill for all these things. And this is where you've got to look at these things with a little bit of pinch of salt. You can moan and protest, but at the same time, is the moaning and protest actually going to make a difference?
Well,
or is there better ways?
Well, let's just finish off by saying this Going Green podcast used no electricity in its production, because basically, yeah, we did use electricity. I've got 3 cameras here. We've got an A10. We've got various other bits and pieces, a couple of laptops here. But in fact, they were charged. And at the moment, we're making all our electricity with solar. We're not actually taking anything from the grid. And when we do the editing, we'll also do that during the daytime, and no electricity is actually used. By the time we actually put it up, and then other people start taking it, downloading it and listening and playing, then that is going to use electricity. But we've tried to do our bit, that when we've actually made this podcast and video, that we haven't used any electricity. And is that better? You've been listening to the Going Green podcast, looking at environmental sort of activism. We'll be back next week with another podcast, having a look at more going green issues. Until then, it's goodbye from me and
a goodbye from me.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.